4 of 110 and 180. Today we're going to talk about typography, gradients, and effects. Now, you have not had, most of you, a typography class yet, so I just want to talk about typography in general terms. Basically, there are two major categorizations of type, and one is called serif and one is called sans serif. And if it has a little tip like this finishing the stroke, it has a little tail there, that is called a serif. And traditionally, most book fonts have serifs. The earliest types had serifs. They go back to the beginning of typography. But there's also sans serifs, and sans serifs from the French, sans being without, don't have those little tips, and those are simpler letter forms and often less ornate letter forms. But both have their place in typography. But there are other ways to look at type too. One is boldness, so this would be a very bold font, and that would be a relatively light font. And another is how squeezed or condensed that font is. So if you look at this font, these are, by the way, all part of the same family of type. They're all related to each other, designed and sold as a system. And when you're starting out with type, I would say a good rule of thumb would be to not use any font that is not part of a family or a system of typography, because that just ensures you're working with something that's a little bit more of a serious effort and a little bit more time and energy went into designing it. There are a lot of free fonts out there on websites like the font, but often, not always, there's some good free fonts as well, but often you get what you pay for, and the fonts you download for free might have missing characters or might be poorly designed. So when you're starting, it's a good idea to use fonts that are part of a system or what a typographer would call a family. So this one is just a little bit squeezed and skinny, and so is that one for that matter, but it's the same weight as this one. I would not use a squeezed font at small sizes because they get a little bit hard to read. But if you have a big headline and you want to jam, if you want your headline to be as big as possible, a font that is condensed like this can be a useful tool for getting your font bigger. And then something else that can vary in fonts a little bit is what size they're intended to be used at. So if you look at this font, and these are fonts I use for one of my side projects. This is a family called Publico, and this is a family called Verb. But if you look at this font, and let's just zoom in on it for a minute. This font is intended to be used at text sizes, essentially the columns in a newspaper or a magazine, where you have lots and lots of fairly small type that's intended for reading. Now, and it's a perfectly good text font. But the trouble with text fonts is they can become a little bit clunky when you put them up to display size. So this is the same family, also Publico, same weight, but it is optimized a little bit more for using at large sizes. And the way that comes through is the contrast in this font is just much higher. It's much more delicate because this is intended to be used big, and so it can be a little bit more contrast. This is because if this is going to be really big, it doesn't matter that this is going to be skinny. If I use that at a small size, and the press was not inked properly, those skinny parts might just drop out of the letter if I was doing print design anyway. And so that's another way that people categorize type, and it's not just serif fonts, but some fonts are categorized for being used at display sizes. If you see a font that's very fancy, it's probably not a good text font. It's probably intended for use at big display sizes. So let's zoom out of that again, and I am going to switch to my type tool, and you may notice that my workspace looks a little bit different, and that's just because I have switched my workspace over from painting, as we've used in previous videos, which gives me some tools that are particularly useful for painting, to typography. And these tools are a little bit more type related. Again, these are the tools, and those are for adjusting the properties of what you have done. So when you select the type tool, you can click, and the program gives you a little bit of what's called Greeking, or lorem ipsum. This is something typographers and designers used to use when they were designing something before they had the final text yet. They would use it just as position text. So it's sort of an inside joke that it gives you this. I actually wish it didn't. It used to just give you a blinking cursor and you could start typing, but now it gives you the lorem ipsum and you have to highlight it and then you can type over it. But once you have that type selected, you can start just typing. Or whatever you want to type. And that is my line of type. And let's just break this into a couple of lines. And I'm just going to put a return in it. This is basically a frame with 2 lines of type in it. And there are a couple other things you could do with this type. You'll note that you have controls for your paragraph and controls for your character. And one of the things you could do with your character is you can give it an indent, you could give it space, and you can, is this in character? Oh, it is in character, which I wouldn't think it would be. But you can also, in character, change the space between text. So to me, these lines look a little bit loose, so I can just type in a number. Now that looks a little bit tight. So to my eye, that looks pretty good. But you can also, as this type happens to be, because the last piece of type I typed was centered, but it doesn't have to be oriented to the center. It could be flush left, or it could be flush right, or it could be centered. And we can also change the size. For that, we can go there, but it's also here. I could just start to make that bigger. And I can also use, because I'm an illustrator, my transform tools to resize it. So this is set on my flip, but here is my scale tool, and I can scale that. And again, I'm holding my shift key, as I did in previous lectures, to make sure that that scales proportionally, but you can also scale it disproportionately, and that can get you in trouble with type 2 because it can get a little bit hard to read and a little bit disproportionate. So let's just zoom in on that. So you can see that we kind of blew the hierarchy of the way this font was designed. There's now this distracting bold line across the top of the letters where the serifs are, and it's really skinny in here. So we've made some pretty ugly typography. So it's best not to squeeze your type or stretch out your type, or at least not do it very much. Sometimes you can get away with a little bit, but I generally make it a principle never to do it. And you can also change the font it's in. So let's just put this, you click. And the nice thing is that the program didn't used to do this, but it'll show me what it looks like in all of these fonts. And There's another display font that is also a high contrast font meant to be used only at pretty large sizes. So that's the type tool. You can change fonts within a box. There's no rule that this all has to be one font. You can also change alignments. So if I wanted to center headline above, I can, my next line does not have to be centered. This could be have a different alignment. And there's no rule that everything in a frame has to be the same color, just like anything else. I can, let's just bring down my swatches palette, and I can make this any color I want. And I can also, even though it's a live piece of type, I can give it a stroke. So let's just give it a green stroke. And I wouldn't advise doing that to typography very often either, because it also kind of distorts the shape of the letter, but it can be done. You can give a stroke to anything, and this is all still perfectly editable. I pick the same layers I did before, but we can make this. And so it is perfectly editable and changeable. So the next thing I want to talk about is, let's zero out of that again, is effects. We'll save gradients for last, even though that's not how it's listed on the sheet. Some of you have discovered some of these on your own, but there are a number of effects you can give type. I would say like type that is, too distracting or too funny looking. It's a good idea to use effects in such a way that they don't become a distraction in your design, but just an enhancement. But there are a lot of effects there that you can use. So if we go here, and I'm going to talk about 3D, I think, next week, but let's talk about the Photoshop effects, and these are all available in Photoshop as well, but the difference is here you are applying them to a vector object, so it is infinitely scalable, and it is also infinitely undoable or rethinkable. So I'm going to go to Effects Gallery, and it opens up in this guy right here, and we have a glass effect, but there's a whole bunch of these. You control these folders open. Some of them will do more, some of them will do a little bit less, and they will give you different sliders for how much you control it. But we can look at this type, and under distortion we can make it more distorted. We can make it more or less smooth. I kind of like it ghosted out like that. And you can change the scale of it. That doesn't do a whole lot. Now, if we were in Photoshop and I wanted to add a second effect to this, I can just click this little icon here, but it doesn't work in Illustrator. I guess that's that icon is saved for another day, but I could just stack up a whole bunch of effects on top of each other if I wanted to. But in Illustrator, I have to say, okay, and then we see this effect, and again, this is all still perfectly editable text. And then if I want, I can give a second effect. So let's go to Effects Gallery again. And let's just try something else. Let's try, I don't think that's going to do. Let's just go back to our artistic and try sponge. And for this one I have brush size and definition, smoothness, and okay. And so I now have this type with two effects on it. Now, something that's very useful in Illustrator and something that lets you revisit decisions you've made, and this will apply to a lot of the things we do, is what is called the appearance panel. And that looks like this little sort of eye pupil shape. And if we click on it, we're basically seeing a list of everything we did to this. And in this case, we've done two things, is glass and sponge. But we could take away, we can make sponge invisible, so we just see it with glass again. We can also make glass invisible, so we just see it with sponge, which doesn't seem to do. And I could go revisit it and readjust it by clicking on the effect. Well, it doesn't seem to do a lot without the glass effect. There it is now with both, with the changes I've made to sponge. And if I decide I don't like one of these effects, I can just hit my little trash can icon and that one will go away. And now it's just back down to glass again. And you'll find that for a whole lot of things in Illustrator, the appearance panel will work that way. There'll be a list of the various things you've done to it or the transformations you've made, and you can always go back and revisit them through the appearance panel, or most of the time you can in any event. So those are effects. There are a whole lot of effects, as you can see. There are 3D effects. There's distortion and transform effects, and it's just not super time efficient for me to go through all of these, but I would suggest that over time you just take a look at them. Remember that they are never going to save a design, but they can be useful for giving it a little finesse or a little something extra, or making it look like it belongs as part of a composition. So now I'm going to talk about gradients, and a few people got a preview of this. So let's just start by drawing a basic shape. And like with everything else, let's just make a copy of that. And let's switch back over to my painting workspace because I'm not seeing the gradient panel. And here's the gradient panel, and here is the gradient tool. So I'm going to select the gradient panel, and I can make a gradient from scratch, which we'll do in a minute, but you can also, as with brushes, open a whole bunch of extras. So there's a whole bunch of swatch libraries that you could open, some based on food, some based on metals, but there's also a number of gradient libraries. So let's select metals, and here is metals, and let's just select on a couple of these. So that one's relatively subtle, that one's a little bit less subtle. And sort of like a silvery, and it's more of a gold. And you can note that gradients can have, a gradient can be simple, it could go from one color to another, but it can also have a number of stops within it. And those stops do not have to be harmonious. It could be anything. So for example, I could select this one and I could double click on it, and it will let me select a different color either by selecting it or typing a number in or moving my sliders, or it will let me select it just by selecting a swatch. But let's just pick something like green, and I can edit that gradient once I've applied it. It doesn't affect the gradient in my library. I still have that, but what Illustrator has done is added this gradient to my document colors as well. I can also, if I decide I don't like that or I don't want that complex a gradient, I can just grab that with my mouse, click it down, and pull it off, and it disappears, and I now have a gradient with fewer stops. But I can pull it off. In addition to pulling it off, I can move these around. And Illustrator, when you create a new color, and we could do that too, I could just click here and then double click again, and let's just select a gray this time. So I can just click and add a color, and I can make a gradient as complex or as simple as I want. And a good way to make gradients is to start from a basis, but you can also make your own. There's also, we moved our desktop, what's called the gradient tool. And let me select that. Looks basically the same as the gradient panel. And that puts a bar across this gradient. And this is a linear gradient. It is going perfectly horizontally, but there's no law that it has to do that. We could redraw this gradient from the upper corner, and we can also do everything with these sliders. Get a smooth transition. We can move those sliders and get anything with that that we want. And this also could be a linear gradient. We saw a couple of these that are, like that one. That's a linear radial gradient. It comes from the center. You can also get it by pushing these two buttons. We can turn this into a linear gradient and then back into a radial gradient. And then I can use the gradient tool the same way. I can move it so it's not centered on the object. So that can be a way to create a highlight, for example, on an object, or make it look like it has a highlight. And I can redraw it, however I want to redraw it. And I can have the same control over the transitions and the stops. And you could give it also an additional color or whatever we want to do with it. Oh, that's nice and ugly. So you can also build a gradient from scratch without going to a library. And I'm going to select this object, and I'm just going to apply a gradient style to it. And this is what I had last, so this is what Illustrator gave me. But if you had not just worked with a gradient, let's make that black. And no, that's a gradient we worked with. But normally what you would see is a transition from black to white. But you would have the same control over this that you would have if you were using a pre-existing gradient. So that's what was on my agenda for today, was gradients, type, and effects. And your assignment for next week is to create a composition that uses type and gradients and some effects. And if you want, that could be an advertisement. You could say, you can make an ad for something. And it also should have some vectors that you've drawn as well. So it could be an advertising for something. It could just be nonsense. It could also be an aphorism. And an aphorism is just something that is, I don't need this anymore, so let me close out of that. An aphorism is just something simple that is said to be true. So No man is an island or a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. All of these might be considered aphorisms. So if you wanted to base your composition on one of those, that would be fine too. The main objective is always is to learn the tools, and to create something aesthetic, but the main thing I'll be looking for is that you have used the tools. Oh, one more thing I meant to show you in the type department. And another useful thing for vectors, this is also something I don't do a whole real often, but it can be a useful thing some of the times, is that you can put type on a path if you want type to be not just straight up and down. So let me just draw out a simple path, and let me get rid of its fill. And then lurking below my type tool is a couple of other type tools. And the one I'm going to select is type on a path. And I can come over here now and click on that path, and the type will follow that path. And that is also one of the ways you can use type in Illustrator. So that is my agenda for today, and I will see you in class later in the week.